Good evening, Mr. Shong, Mr. and Mrs. Caruso, Dr. Zielinski, Mr. DeCure, Fulbright Scholars, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. You've done tremendous work for the Fulbright program since taking on the role of Executive Director last year. And knowing that you're settled here in Canberra after having lived and served in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States is really a testament to the appeal of Canberra and to your dedication to the Australian-US relationship. Thanks to all of you for being here tonight to support the Fulbright program and to celebrate and recognize this year's Fulbright Scholars. I have long known and respected the Fulbright program. In fact, in 2002, I worked with colleagues at the State Department to launch the first ever Fulbright-sponsored conference to bring together women from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and Central and Southern Asia to focus on the role of women as leaders in the global community. I'm honored to have been asked to share this special evening with all of you to come together on March 8th. Why has Fulbright planned the dinner on March 8th? My banker husband would probably say we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the New York Stock Exchange on March 8th, 1817. The foreign policy wonks among us may say we're celebrating the founding of the first modern Arab state, the Kingdom of Syria, on March 8th, 1920. The French exchange student that I'm currently housing might say we should celebrate the opening of Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris on March 8th, 1974. Or perhaps, given the venue, we could be commemorating the week in 1913 when Canberra was named, beating out such other suggestions as Austral, Eden, Hopeton, and Aurora. Canberra is a word that means meeting place in the language of the Ngunnawal people. But in fact, none of those are the reasons I'm here. Obviously, it's because March 8th for the past 100+ years has been celebrated as International Women's Day. Many years ago, I stood on a stage similar to this one in Istanbul, Turkey, to address a Fulbright conference on bridging the gap between academia and public policy. I pointed out that ensuring women's rights around the world strengthens democracy, bolsters prosperity, enhances stability, and encourages tolerance. I said it is at the core of building a civil law-abiding society, which is a true prerequisite for democracy. And as the situation for women in Turkey and around the world shows us today, the struggle for women's rights is not just about speech-making or celebrating advancements one day a year. It's a daily struggle for women to be treated equally. So it is right and fitting that the Fulbright Gala is held this year in Canberra, as this city was the site of the signing of the treaty that established the Fulbright program in Australia. That treaty was, in fact, the first treaty between the two countries. It predates the ANZUS Treaty by nearly 2 years. It is also right and fitting that we gather here in Parliament House, a building designed by a Fulbrighter, Romaldo Gergola, an alumnus of the Italian-American Fulbright program. In 1979, his Philadelphia-based firm won an international competition to design the Commonwealth of Australia's new Parliament House. 10 years later, he was named an honorary officer of the Order of Australia, and then he became a citizen in the year 2000. He designed the building, a meeting place for MPs and a symbol of Australia's democracy. It's a house for people, a place where national decisions are taken and celebrations are marked, a place where memorials are recognized. And at this point, I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people who are the traditional custodians of the Canberra area and pay respect to the elders, past and present, of all of Australia's Indigenous people. It is right and fitting that we meet in the Australian capital, the quintessential capital, a capital planned by American architects, Marion and Walter Burley Griffin. Everybody talks a lot about Walter, but I think tonight especially it's really important that we remember Marion. In the great tradition of the woman behind the star architect, like Penelope and Harry Seidler, Charles and Ray Eames, Marion was an accomplished architect in her own right. She was only the second woman to graduate in architecture from what later became known as the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which was the preeminent architecture school in the US at the time. And she was, in fact, the first female in the US to become a licensed architect. It was Marion who encouraged Walter to enter the competition, and she was responsible for many of the brilliant drawings that were sent to Melbourne as part of their entry. Canberra was a city born of compromise, and compromise now more than ever is at the heart of political achievement. At the turn of the last century, a fierce rivalry existed between Sydney and Melbourne, much like today. I've heard Sydney sider David Pemberthy quip, "If you find yourself getting misty-eyed about the Yarra, you've probably been drinking from it." But I've also heard Melburnian Waleed Ali point out, "Sun and beauty rarely coexist with intelligence." So a century ago, the competition was just as ferocious and a compromise was called for, and the new capital city was established here between the great contenders. The same thing happened in my hometown of Washington, D.C. After the Civil War, some political and business leaders wanted the capital to be in New York or Philadelphia. Others wanted it to be in the South, each fearing that the other side would become too powerful if the capital was in their midst, refused to compromise. Finally, through some financial negotiations, they decided the capital would be a square made up of Maryland and Virginia territory. And as President Trump's campaign has reminded us, Washington was actually built on a swamp. It is right and fitting that we are meeting on International Women's Day, a collective day of global celebration, a call for gender parity. No one government, NGO, charity, corporation, academic institution, women's network, or media hub is the sole custodian for International Women's Day. It belongs to all of us. The United Nations sets a theme each year for International Women's Day, and the 2017 theme is Be Bold for Change. I'm wearing purple today. This is the official color of International Women's Day because it signifies justice and dignity. I'm so pleased to be here to talk to you about women's rights, human rights, an issue I'm passionate about and I've worked to promote in the US, Australia, and around the world. Obviously, women and girls make up half of the world's population, but frequently their voices and experiences are marginalized. No country can achieve its full potential if it leaves half its population behind. Females are less well represented in government and business worldwide, and many barriers exist that prevent or delay progress in the developed and developing world alike. Undervaluing and underutilizing contributions of women and girls has political, economic, and social implications. It affects the outcome of elections. It can limit the ability of companies to increase profits. It can prevent companies from improving their own economies. It can preclude regions from producing enough food. Limited female participation benefits no one. Global advancement is hobbled by the lack of female involvement across the board. Conversely, we know that diversity is good for business. As the 2017 Bain Report for Chief Executive Women stated, a strong link exists between diverse organizations and better business outcomes, where gender balance is the yardstick for overall diversity. And a study from the World Bank confirms that countries that reduce the gender gap also decrease levels of corruption. So though much needs to be done, there have been some important achievements in curtailing discrimination and increasing women's rights. Some of these achievements are truly inspirational. I'm particularly familiar with certain aspects of this progress and proud to have served both my country and women around the world in promoting them. I'll take just a few minutes to share some examples of the progress on women's issues that the United States has achieved at home and abroad, and then I'll talk a bit about the Australian experience. I'll conclude with a spotlight on the education sector, highlighting the role that the Fulbright program plays. The Office of International Women's Issues at the State Department was created in 1995 to promote the rights and empowerment of women and girls through U.S. foreign policy. Working with the White House, the Pentagon, USAID, and other agencies, civil society, and the private sector, this office spearheads multiple wide-ranging global initiatives. It currently reports directly to the Secretary of State and was most recently led by Ambassador Kathy Russell. Among its priorities is promoting women's economic opportunities, integrating women into the peace and security process, preventing violence against women, and ensuring women's political participation. I was honored to have led this office in the early 2000s. One of the biggest projects I worked on while in office was the creation of the U.S.-Afghan Women's Council. It was a joint undertaking between President George W. Bush and Afghan President Hamid Karzai. The council was a first, a PPP, a public-private partnership, promoting cooperation among U.S. and Afghan institutions. The Council began as a way to mobilize private sector resources to help Afghan women. Specifically, the Council was established to identify concrete actions to bring real and practical benefits to the women of Afghanistan and to enable them to participate and take leadership roles in the political and economic life of their country. During my time in office, I was privileged to travel to Afghanistan representing the US government to witness firsthand the joy of 7- and 8-year-old girls going to school for the very first time in their lives with donated resources. And I brought one of those USAID-created school backpacks home, and I take it out of the closet sometimes to show my children. It's a small string denim backpack. It has a slate board in it and a piece of chalk, a quill that's made out of a small piece of bamboo that's been cut at an angle at the end, a little sachet of dried ink powder, and a small plastic bottle where you put the powder in and mix it up with water. And to my children, with their MacBook Airs and Smiggle backpacks, it's another world. Now, let's fast forward from Afghanistan in 2002 to Australia in 2011. Right here in Canberra, about 6 years ago, then Prime Minister Julia Gillard, Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd, and Minister for the Status of Women Kate Ellis established the position Ambassador for Women and Girls. Penny Williams was the first appointee, then Natasha Stott-Despoja, and currently Sharman Stone is the Ambassador for Women and Girls. The creation of this position in Australia reflected the government's commitment globally, with a focus, of course, in the Asia-Pacific, to promote gender equality and give women a stronger voice. The position was created to ensure that the empowerment of women and girls is a central focus of Australia's diplomatic, development, and defense concerns. By advocating internationally for women's equal participation in political, economic, and social affairs, the Australian government relies on its ambassador to advance global progress, peace, and stability. Consistent with the close relations between Australia and the United States, I understand this role was partly modeled on the American experience earlier in establishing the Office of International Women's Issues. And finally, of great interest to those of us in the educational sector is what is happening with higher education and women's leadership. At the time I enrolled at Georgetown University, there wasn't a single Australian university that had ever been run by a woman, not one. Despite women being admitted as medical students as early as the 1880s, both at Georgetown University and at University of Sydney, where I now am, the first female vice chancellor in Australia was not to assume her position until 100 years later. Diane Yerbury at Macquarie University became the first female Australian VC in 1987. Currently in Australia, there are 11 female vice chancellors, covering about a quarter of Australian universities. The United States, with a much larger base and many more universities, has seen 84 female university or college presidents, starting in 1925. And what about the Australian Fulbright Commission specifically? How does this organization, founded almost 70 years ago, fit in with International Women's Day? I looked at the historical records, and over time, the balance has been about 3/4 male, but in the recent past, it's come much closer to parity, and the last 2 years, it's been almost exactly equal. The Fulbright Award started to be given in Australia in 1950, and the inaugural group had 2 women. The first was already mentioned by the chargé, Dorothy Monroe Scheinberg. She departed for the US on the 1st of August, 1950. She was to become a pioneer historian of the Pacific. Her research and teaching upon her return to Australia influenced many scholars in the Pacific and Asian studies, including some future Fulbright scholars. In 1950s Australia, it was a very radical decision to go to the US for further study. Dorothy described it this way: "To go to America for further study was an unusual thing for a Melbourne graduate to do in those days. The norm was to go to Oxford, or if the worst came to worst, Cambridge, even if it was only to repeat the last 2 years of an Australian undergraduate degree. Anything else didn't count." Dorothy Monroe Scheinberg went on to create, as Jim said, the first ever course in Pacific history taught in Australia. Plant biochemist Adele Millard was the other of the 2 first Australian women to win the Fulbright Award. She left in September 1951 for California, where she took up a research assistant position at Caltech, at a time when women were not even admitted to the university as postgraduate students. She was a pioneer in so many ways. When you think about it, at that time, contact with your family meant sending a letter that would take weeks to arrive. And she reflected on this in an interview archived with the National Library of Australia on how she learned not just a lot academically, but generally in traveling for the first time overseas to the US. And I'm sure a lot of you in this room are looking forward to that, whether it's your first trip or your 10th trip. You're going to be learning a lot about your host country. Adele returned to Australia and had a long and distinguished scientific career at the University of Sydney and CSIRO, and served as the president of Australian Society of Plant Scientists. Another notable Fulbrighter I'd like to mention is Jill Kerr Conway. After graduating from the University of Sydney with honors in 1958, she headed to the US. As she explained, Jill felt at that time women had no possibility of a full career in academia in Australia. She had just been turned down for a position at the Department of External Affairs by an all-male committee just before she decided to go to Harvard for her PhD in American Studies. It's worth noting that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade is now led by a woman, Frances Adamson. Jill eventually became the first female president of Smith College, the largest American women's college and alma mater of Julia Child, Betty Friedan, Nancy Reagan, Gloria Steinem, and Sylvia Plath. Jill is now a professor at MIT and sits on a number of high-profile boards, such as Nike, Colgate, and Merrill Lynch. She was also the first female chair of the board of directors of Lend-Lease. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge Nancy Millis. Millis was born in Melbourne in 1922, the fifth of 6 children. The University of Melbourne refused entry to the Bachelor of Science program to her, but they said she could enroll in agricultural studies, which is what she did, and she earned not only a bachelor's, but a master's. Then she went overseas on a Boots Fellowship to the University of Bristol. When she completed her PhD in 1951, she came back to Australia with intentions to work at the Carlton United Brewery, but they would not employ women in their laboratories at that time. So she joined the Department of Microbiology at the University of Melbourne, and in 1954, she won a Fulbright grant and went to Hopkins Marine Station at Stanford University. Millis was the chancellor of La Trobe University from 1992 until her retirement in 2006. So obviously, Australia has made great advances with women in leadership since then. Everyone from board member where I work at the US Studies Center, Christina Keneally, who was sworn in as the first female Premier of New South Wales by the female state governor, Marie Bashir, to Dame Quinton Bryce, who was Governor General of Australia and before that Governor of Queensland, to Julia Gillard, who was the first female Prime Minister, and of course the current Minister for Foreign Affairs, Julie Bishop. In my opinion, the first female ambassador to the US cannot be long way away. So Australia has made progress, and at this point it is right and fitting that we join together to congratulate the Fulbright Commission, its university, government, and private sector sponsors for funding scholarships for both Australian and American scholars. When the Fulbright program was first envisioned in 1946, it was intended not only to foster academic excellence, but also to build mutual understanding. At a time when some are questioning the bilateral alliance and what it means to be a global citizen, the mission of Fulbright in building cultural bridges has never been more important. I earlier told the story of Adele Millard. Adele couldn't be here tonight, but she taped a message for us at her home here in Canberra on Monday afternoon.
Greetings, distinguished ladies and gentlemen gathered here this evening, and especially greetings to the new Fulbright scholars. My name is Adele Millard, and 67 years ago, I was in the very first cohort of students who went to the United States. There were 25 of us and only one other woman. The Fulbright experience transformed my life, as it has for so many other men and women, both American and Australian. It's been a total joy to see how Senator Fulbright's imaginative scheme has just gathered strength as the years have gone by. I will congratulate each and every one of the scholars here tonight, and I hope your experience will be as everything you could possibly wish. Good night.
To all of the 2017 Fulbright Scholars, Australians and Americans alike, our heartiest congratulations. We wish you every success. We hope your Fulbright experience will be as transformative, just like Adele's was for her, and we all look forward to learning of your achievements in the decades to come. Thank you.
I'd like to thank April on behalf of everyone for a terrific speech. It was really, really good to have you here. As I say, you embody all the characteristics that we look for in Fulbright, and it was terrific that you came down from Sydney to be with us. We wanted to give you something nice from the ACT to bring back with you. So, it's wine. We'll carry it for you. It's good wine, too. Some of it you're going to need to wait for, but really, thanks very, very much for it. Thanks for being here, and I join you in congratulating all of tonight's scholars. Thanks. Great. And this ends the formal part. I think dessert and coffee is going to be served. We look forward to having the chance to network with everyone, and thank you for being here. Again, congratulations to all the 2017 scholars.